Protagoras and the Sophists, an overview by Dr. Israelson. So who were the Sophists? Well, in the ancient Hellenic world, from around 600 BC to 300 BC, two new types of thinkers emerged. On the one hand, we had the philosophers, exemplified by people like Thales, Xenophanes, Parmenides, Heraclitus, and so on. These earliest philosophers believed that human beings had a share in the divine logos, and as such could come to understand the nature of things with time and effort. Think of Xenophanes, quote, "Not from the beginning have the gods revealed all things to mortals, but in time, by seeking, they come upon what is better." In other words, the philosophical presupposition or presumption is that knowledge is possible, that there is truth, that the world makes sense, that there's a logos, a logic, a reason to the world. There's a reason to the things that happen. Things aren't just random occurrences. Things happen as part of an overarching logical system, plan. Things work for purposes, right, etc. That there is structure in the world and that we can find it. On the other hand, we had the Sophists, so-called wise men. The word sophist, of course, is the same word that we see in philosophers. Sophia relates to wisdom. But notice the difference. The philosophers define themselves as lovers of wisdom, whereas by calling themselves sophists, these people claim, as it were, almost to have wisdom, masters of wisdom as opposed to mere lovers of it. So they claim, at least, right? This is related to the word sophisticated. So contra the optimism of the philosophers, there arose another class of thinkers, the Sophists. These were paid teachers and rhetoricians, and they denied the reality and or possibility of objective truth and knowledge. So where the philosophers were filled with sort of epistemic hope that we could come to understand the world, the Sophists were far more pessimistic and saw knowledge far more as a weapon than as any sort of divine gift or divine ambition that we might have. The famous line from Protagoras that sums up the view of the Sophists is this: "Man is the measure of all things." So let's analyze this famous phrase. We have very little extant text from Protagoras. We don't have much from a lot of the Sophists. We have some, but just like the early pre-Socratic philosophers, many of these works have been lost to time. But we have some lines that are at least attributed to Heraclitus. To Protagoras. Most famous is this one, that man is the measure of all things. So what does this mean, to say that man is the measure of all things? Well, what does it mean to measure something? What does measure connote or denote? Well, to measure something means to interpret, to assign meaning or a given value to compare to other things of a similar sort, to find a use for, to make sense of, and so on and so forth. To measure is to do all of those things. So to say that man is the measure of all things thus would seem to mean that things, or nature, or the world, lack independent meaning. All meaning is assigned by human beings. So Plato, for whom the Sophists are always the big enemy to be defeated, Plato responded to this line of Protagoras saying, no, not man, but God is the measure of all things. And right there we can see the difference between the Sophists and the philosophers. The philosopher looks for an objective standard, an objective measure. The Sophists say there's only subjective standards, only subjective measures. These are not ideas that you haven't heard of before. These ideas, this kind of relativism, sophistical relativism, has been very popular in the 20th century. These kind of ideas have really seen a resurgence with deconstructionism, postmodernism. They're just all new forms of sophistry. These are very old ideas, not very new ones. So the Sophists were paid teachers. They had very much a mercenary mentality towards knowledge and learning. They spent their days as paid teachers, wandering the ancient world, mastering the languages, customs, beliefs, and superstitions of various groups of people in order to position themselves as master teachers. They taught the sons of the elite how to win lawsuits and gain advantageous social positions. They really saw knowledge as simply a weapon, right? Remember those, signs or little posters from your kindergarten class that said, knowledge is power? Well, the Sophists took that idea very literally. Knowledge is literally political power. So as I just mentioned, Plato sees the Sophists as engaged in a project diametrically opposed to that of philosophy, and one that is incredibly socially dangerous. If there's no truth, then anything goes. If there are no norms of conduct, nothing to base our lives and be stable on, then anything is permitted. So let's talk about rhetoric for a moment. As I mentioned, the Sophists are all master rhetoricians. Rhetoric is the art of persuasion. Philosophical argument attempts to convince by appeals to logos, conceptual clarity, and rigorous logical inference. By contrast, rhetoric attempts to persuade through any means necessary. Think informal logical fallacies, begging to question, ad hominems, attacks on someone's character or personality, any appeals to emotion, appeals to tradition, appeals to authority, anything that needs to happen to get someone to vote your way or buy your product, right? That's what rhetoric looks like. Rhetoric is, of course, a part of daily life. Certain activities, such as politics and advertising, deal almost exclusively with rhetoric. Very rarely do you hear an actual argument in a political campaign or an advertising campaign. You hear rhetorical appeals. But at the same time, philosophy also always has a rhetorical aspect, or many rhetorical aspects. There is no doing away with rhetoric. Rhetoric is everything we do has some sort of rhetorical implication, from the clothing we wear to the words we choose to use. It's just the way that we sort of socially present ourselves and how effective those presentations are. So rhetoric is not the enemy as such. Only rhetoric unmoored from any actual argument is. Unprincipled rhetoric is very dangerous. But again, rhetoric is a part of life. There's no doing away with it, per se. So all of this kind of leads us to this central idea that we find in the Sophists and in the sort of post-structuralists of today, namely that of relativism. There are a variety of ways to interpret Protagoras' claim that, quote, man is the measure of all things. The strongest interpretation would make Protagoras into an epistemic relativist. Epistemology is the word that means study of knowledge. So an epistemic relativist would be someone who denied any sort of consistent and coherent and lasting knowledge claims, but that all claims of knowledge would be relativistic. This could be summarized in the very provocative expression, there is no truth. Now, clearly, there's a problem with this utterance. What is wrong with this assertion, logically speaking? Well, think about it. If we say there is no truth, presumably, we're making a truth claim. To make a proposition is to make a truth claim. And presumably, if I'm making the claim, I must think it's true. Otherwise, why bother saying it? So if it's true that there is no truth, which I must think, otherwise I wouldn't say it, then it's false that there is no truth, because now we have at least one true claim, namely that there is no truth. Same problem happens if I say everything is mere opinion. Same issue, right? If everything is mere opinion, then this assertion is mere opinion, and thus isn't truth, and thus I don't have to take it seriously. On the other hand, if I take myself to be saying something other than mere opinion with this statement, namely making a universal truth claim, then I've undercut myself because I've made a universal truth claim, which I'm saying is impossible since everything is mere opinion. It just doesn't make sense. Epistemic relativism is sort of completely logically self-contradictory and incoherent. So at this point, what most relativists will do is they'll make a move from epistemic to moral relativism. Complete epistemic relativism is impossible to defend logically, as I just showed above, right? I don't see any way out of this basic problem. If we try to say there is no truth, there is no standard of truth, we necessarily invoke the very standard that we're saying is impossible. So it just isn't going to work. A more common version of this sort of view, then, is what's known as moral relativism or normative relativism. Since morality is invisible, as it were, and not a physical object or system of objects, but a set of invisible guiding principles, it is more coherent, initially at least, to argue that values are relative, as opposed to everything being relative. Usually the argument of the Sophists take the form of this sort of moral relativism, as opposed to a complete epistemic relativism. So let's consider three basic questions as a way of investigating the plausibility of such normative relativism. First question is there such a thing as right and wrong? Second question, what is right and wrong? And the third question, what makes things right and wrong? In what follows, I really want to focus on the first one, just kind of recognizing that these latter two are sort of grounding moral questions that would follow. But if the sophists are correct and man is the measure of all things, that's really just a way of saying there's no such thing as intrinsic right or wrong. Every value judgment is an expression of mere opinion, one's social position, individual position, cultural place, etc. So let's examine whether we think that's plausible or not. So let's go ahead and sketch what we might call a moral spectrum, or a spectrum of views or answers to question one. Is there such a thing as right and wrong? Option one would be simply yes, there is such a thing as right and wrong, right? Now, of course, saying yes, there's such a thing as right and wrong doesn't immediately entail that you know the answers to particular questions of morality, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you have a moral doctrine on hand, but the basic idea or assumption that right and wrong are real things, we would call this position moral realism, right? Option two would be no. There is no such a thing as right and wrong. We will call the position corresponding to this answer moral nihilism, right? Nihilism is from the Latin nihil, which means nothing. So nihilism or nihilism is nothingism, right? So moral nothingism, moral nihilism is the view that morality is totally fictitious, totally false. Option three is a kind of sort of answer, right, which I'll be describing in more detail in what follows, but we will call the position corresponding to this answer moral relativism. All right, so if we have them on a spectrum here, then we'd have obviously moral realism and moral nihilism on opposite sides, with moral relativism somewhere in the middle. So moral nihilism might be defined as the position that morality is complete nonsense, and that no moral claims have any meaning, right? Morality is just a completely fictitious set of ideas and constraints that humans have come up with that has no basis in fact or reality, and hence has no real claim upon us. Moral realism would be the position that morality is something real, and that moral claims pick out real truths, right? Now note, as we'll discuss in what follows, that many different types of moral positions that defend moral realism are possible. Being a moral realist doesn't necessarily mean you're committed to one or another meta-ethical position on what grounds moral value. It just means that you think that there's such a thing as objective moral truth, that there are some things that are objectively good and others that are objectively bad. By objectively, I mean the opposite of subjectively. A subjective claim is one that's unique to me. So if I say vanilla is the best ice cream flavor, well, that couldn't really be objectively true or false. It's just a matter of taste. But when I say murder is wrong, I don't think I'm saying something like vanilla is the best ice cream flavor. I think I'm saying something that I take to be universally true, that it's a universal moral claim that's true for everyone, even if they don't recognize it. Moral relativism would thus be the position that morality is meaningful and real in a sense, but that what it commands differs from person to person or from culture to culture. So there are moral truths, but they're different for different people. So let's consider these different views. First up, we have moral realism. I have a picture here of Jesus delivering the Sermon on the Mount and Krishna teaching Arjuna about the nature of his duty and destiny. These are the two central moral teaching moments in Christianity and Hinduism, respectively. So let's call moral realism the overarching view that there is such a thing as objective moral truth, right? And again, I just define what I mean by objective, that it's true for everyone, even if people don't recognize it. So for instance, if I say it is wrong to enslave people, right, I'm making an objective moral claim. And what I think I'm saying is not that I simply dislike slavery, or that for me it's wrong to enslave people, but that for everybody it's wrong to enslave people. And if you enslave someone else, you are doing something that is objectively wrong. You are incorrect to do that, regardless of what you may think about it. Right? That's the claim here. So note that by real, I don't mean the same as physical, right? Nor do I mean that moral truths can be located through scientific investigation. Real is not the same as physical, right? There's a lot of real things that aren't physical. Numbers are real, right? But they aren't physical. They're metaphysical or, mathematical, in this case, ideas, right? Ideas of quantity, abstract notions. So by real, I don't mean physical, because certainly whatever morality is, it's not the sort of thing that science, physics, or chemistry could ever discover. Science is in the business of describing things, not prescribing actions, right? As I put it in my other video, science can tell me what will happen if I push someone off of a building, but not that I shouldn't do that, right? So that's not what I mean by real. By real, I just mean metaphysically real in some abstract sense. Note 2,
Other philosophers may well use the term moral realism in a distinct way from how I'm using it here, right? As with everything in philosophy, people use terms in different ways, right? So if you hear someone else using the word moral realism in an article or something, they might mean the same thing that I mean here, they might not, right? But when I use that term here and in the class generally, from moving forward, I'll be using it as defined above, right? The overarching view that there is such a thing as objective moral truth, whatever form that might take, right? So again, I mean, we have here two distinct religions. Both of these religions are morally realistic. Hinduism holds there are actual moral codes, the same for everyone. Christianity holds the same thing, right? They're both moral realists. Are they both correct? Well, I mean, that's a different question, right? But they're both defending a morally realistic worldview. So, as I've said, any number of meta-ethical views about the nature of morality could give rise to a moral code rightfully designated as real. For instance, a divine command ethic, the view that God institutes real moral commands that everyone must follow. A rationalistic ethic, the view that reason makes manifest basic necessary moral commands that everyone must follow. A natural law ethic, the view that some fact or facts of human nature express basic truths that entail moral commands that everyone must, or at least would be wise, to follow. It's even possible to be a moral realist and be uncertain about the foundations, right? Someone may plausibly claim to be certain in a basic intuitive way that, say, murder and rape are wrong without having any story to tell about what makes them wrong. Now, presumably there must be some story there, but someone could very plausibly say, I just follow my conscience, I feel like I have a moral sense, I'm not sure what makes these things right and wrong, but I'm pretty sure that some things are right and some things are wrong, right? Now, we're going to be looking at theories that correspond to the first three. The last one's not a theory, so we're not going to look at a theory that corresponds to it because it isn't a theory. But the first three, we're going to be looking at theories this semester that correspond to all of these. We'll be looking at divine command ethic theories, rationalistic ethics in the form of Kant, natural law with Aristotle, right? So we'll see a variety of views here that correspond to a basic type of moral realism. In other words, being committed to the reality of morality does not immediately commit one to any particular story about what makes things right or wrong. Moral realism can thus accommodate a number of different views about the nature of ultimate reality, right? So a moment ago I asked, okay, so both Christianity and Hinduism, as well of course as Islam, really any of the other Buddhism, any major world religion is going to be committed to some type of moral realism, right? Now, insofar as they have different grounding metaphysical accounts, it would seem they can't all simultaneously be correct, right? But again, my job here is not to determine which religion is correct. My job here is to determine what constitutes moral realism. And all of these positions correspond to a moral realism. And to the extent that these types of traditions overlap, right, we might say that they all express true moral claims, right? There's a reason why every major world religion has basically the same set of commands. Don't kill, treat others as you would want to be treated, because those things seem so basic and obvious that there's really no getting past them or around them. So again, for example, both Hindus and Christians are moral realists, though they disagree about the ultimate nature of reality that makes things right and wrong. Okay. So we're going to talk next about moral nihilism. But before we do, let's just talk about nihilism more generally, right? A nihilist in general, right? If someone claims to be a nihilist, this is a person who holds or claims to hold the belief that nothing matters, right? Nothing has importance. Not history, not the actions of human beings, not even their own desires or needs. None of these things matter. The world, the universe is simply a huge cosmic accident, and nothing has any significance whatsoever. So when taken to its extreme, a nihilist will attempt to claim the following. There is no truth, right? This would be perhaps the most extreme imaginable claim that a nihilist could make. There is no truth. There's a problem with this claim, though, right? To say that there's no truth, and again, when you hear people say this sometimes or play around with this view, I think it's quite common amongst young people who are kind of testing out their own mental powers for the first time, and they feel a bit rebellious, so they try on this nihilistic set of clothes. But if we think about it, there's a huge problem with saying there is no truth, right? Because we have to simply ask, okay, is it true that there is no truth, right? The nihilist is making a claim here, a proposition, a statement, there is no truth. Now, presumably they're making this statement because they think it's worth making, i.e. because they think it's true. But if it's true that there is no truth, then it's false that there is no truth, because we now have a truth claim, namely the claim that there is no truth. On the other hand, if it's false that there is no truth, which it certainly is, then truth remains. Right? The problem here is a basic logical one. You can't utilize propositional assertions in order to deny the validity of any propositional assertion. Right? If you say there is no truth, you've made a truth claim. And if you're taking yourself seriously and actually trying to make a truth claim, then you've undercut your thesis. All right, so nihilism itself is conceptually incoherent. Um, it doesn't seem as though it's going to work for these basic reasons. However, moral nihilism might be a view someone could coherently adopt. A moral nihilist would claim that morality does not actually exist. Nothing is either right or wrong, right? Now, again, they might not be making the basic logical problem or mistake here, right? Because they could probably say, there is no such thing as morality, right? That doesn't get them into the logical trouble that there is no such thing as truth makes. They're simply asserting that morality doesn't correspond to anything real in the nature of the world, in the nature of reality, right? So take a given moral claim, right? A very common one, that murder is morally wrong, right? Most people will agree with this claim, I think. Well, in general, as I noted a moment ago, any given proposition must have one of two truth values, either true or false. Right? Propositions can't be both true and false, nor can they normally be neither true nor false. Right? A proposition is either true or it's false. The moral nihilist, however, will claim that moral claims have no truth value at all because they are essentially nonsensical utterances. Right? They're just nonsense. Um, here's an example of a nonsensical claim. If I say the current king of France is bald, is that a true or a false claim? Well, it seems as though the answer is neither, because it's a nonsensical utterance. There is no current king of France, right? The proposition is poorly formed and thus has no truth value, right? If I were to say something like, green rises swiftly, then sinks into jealousy. Green rises swiftly, then sinks into jealousy. What in the world am I even talking about, right? It doesn't seem to be either true or false because it seems to be nonsense, right? The moral nihilist will argue that the same is true for any moral claim. Such claims are simply nonsense. Right? So the moral nihilist, when they hear the claim murder is morally wrong, they won't say that's false, right? Because to say it's false indicates there's some sense to the proposition of the assertion, and hence it can be accepted or refuted. They will say instead that's totally nonsense. The word wrong doesn't mean anything, right? It's just nonsense. It just doesn't make any sense. Okay, so such a view, the moral nihilist view, may be logically coherent, but it seems to me that it would be psychologically impossible for a human being to actually hold. Such a person, a moral nihilist, would have no grounds to complain about any conceivable action, or to prefer any course of action to any other. Right? Even seeing to their own interests. We might expect a moral nihilist to be just sort of an embitteredly selfish person, right? But even that would seem to be conceptually out of bounds, because that would be to implicitly adopt a moral perspective, that of ethical egoism, right? If someone acts in their own self-interest, they're saying there is value somewhere in the world, right? And that value is me getting what I want. But that's a moral position, right? So the moral nihilist, to be completely conceptually faithful to his or her idea, would have to have no interests at all, would have to give no preference at all to any possible course of action, but would have to view every action as equally morally indifferent. And again, maybe that's logically possible, but I don't know that it's psychologically possible. And, I certainly can't see why it would be desirable. Why would this be a position you would want to adopt? All right, so we've done a bit on moral realism and moral nihilism, right? So now we come to one that a lot of people seem to conceptually favor, at least initially, and that is moral relativism, or what I'm going to here call normative relativism. Normative relativism holds that there are moral truths, but that they are relative, right? And they might be relative in, minimally one of two ways, right? Some people will hold a very strong version of relativism known as individual relativism, the claim that moral truths are relative to individuals. So, for instance, the claim X is bad would be, if a given individual finds X to be bad, they would say, oh, that X is bad, the claim that X is bad is true for me, right? But it might not be true for you. Well, I mean, look, people talk this way sometimes, but we have to wonder, does this make any sense whatsoever? Can a given claim be true for one person and false for another? Now, look, I mean, if we're just talking about the assertion of opinions, then we're not talking about truth claims. So, for instance, if someone says, I prefer jeans over khakis, right? Okay, fine, right? But that's a different claim than saying jeans are better than khakis, right? I mean, if they say I prefer them, yeah, of course, but it's not really a truth claim. It's an assertion of an opinion. It's an assertion of a personal preference, and that's different from making a truth claim, right? It would seem as though something can't be true for one person and false for another, right? That would lead us to the absurd position that murder might be okay for Joe, but not okay for Tim, because Joe feels that it's okay and Tim doesn't. Very implausible, right? Okay, cultural relativism is a bit more of a plausible view, and this is the view that moral truths are relative to cultures, right? And it seems initially more plausible because, right off the bat, cultures we recognize do, in fact, differ quite a lot on moral questions and moral matters. Different cultures have different moral views, different moral standards, right? Now, that's obvious. It's obvious that different cultures have different moral standards. So we need to make a distinction here between descriptive and normative claims, right? If we're talking about morality descriptively, right, we're just talking about what people happen to believe, right? So here's a descriptive claim, moral claim. Hindus burn their dead, right? It's commonplace in the Hindu religion and most Indian religions not to bury the dead, but instead to burn them, right? It's a cultural difference, right? They burn their dead, whereas most Christian nations bury their dead. Um, that's a descriptive claim. It simply says that something is the case, right? So descriptive relativism is obviously true. Descriptively, as a matter of fact, people believe different things. That's beyond dispute. But the claim here is more radical than that. The claim is normative relativism. And a normative relativist doesn't simply hold that people engage in different moral behaviors, right? They hold that everyone is right to engage in morality in the way that they do. Everyone's moral position is true for them, either as an individual or as a society. So a corresponding normative claim would be it is morally correct to burn the dead. Or, of course, it is morally incorrect to burn the dead, right? Those are both normative claims, right? So think about the distinction here as follows. A descriptive claim simply states how something is. A normative claim is also called a prescriptive claim. It prescribes how things ought to be, right? Descriptive describes, normative prescribes, tells us you shouldn't do that or you should do that, right? Now, look, when it comes to this question, the question of how to dispose of the dead, it's very likely that there is no correct way to do it, right? And this might be one of the many issues on which cultural moral disagreement is perfectly acceptable, right? That we can say, sure, it's perfectly fine if you dispose of your dead this way, we'll do it this way. It doesn't seem like something that I'm willing to or interested in getting into an argument over. What's more correct, burning or burying? I don't know. It doesn't seem to really matter. Um, but take something else, something a little bit more morally loaded, such as the disenfranchisement of women, right? Now, there are many nations and cultures, descriptive claim here, that refuse to grant political rights to women, that don't let women vote, right? I mean, we were such a nation ourselves until about 100, a little more than 100, no, yeah, about 100 years ago, right? And many nations still do this. They refuse to grant political rights to women. That's a descriptive claim, right? Some cultures refuse to grant political rights to women. But here's a normative claim. These cultures are wrong to refuse to grant political rights to women. Or the converse normative claim, these cultures are correct, right, in their own way to refuse to grant political rights to women. Those are normative claims, right? Now, the normative relativist, again, has to be committed to the view that each culture is correct about their own moral standards, right? That we can't judge other cultures' moral standards. But that means that cultures who refuse to grant political rights to women are perfectly justified in doing so. It's their culture, right? And that doesn't sit well with me, right? I think that I'd like to be able to say, no, they're wrong to do that, right? They ought to allow women the right to vote. They ought to allow them a role in the political process, right? And if they don't do that, they refuse to do that, then they're wrong for refusing to do that. All right, cultural relativism continued. So given the initial seeming problems here, I mean, why are people so attracted to this view? Because a lot of people do find it attractive, right? And I think the reason is that it seems to promote tolerance and respect for other cultures. And tolerance and respect are good things, right? We ought to try to be tolerant when we can. We ought to be respectful of differences between people, obviously, right? Those are lessons that we've all learned. It seems to promote that. But does it actually promote that, right? Is it actually promoting tolerance and respect? That's a question we're going to have to consider, right? And in an attempt to answer it, I mean, let's just consider a few possible problems with cultural relativism. The first problem is a very basic one. It's a basic logical problem, right? Let's suppose that we have three different civilizations, three different cultures. First, we have culture A, and culture A are cultural relativists. The dominant cultural and moral view here is normative relativism, normative cultural relativism. They believe that every country is correct, every people is correct in what they happen to believe. Then we have culture B, and these are moral absolutists. We'll call them moral absolutists type 1 of the first type, right? I don't have a theory in mind here, just of a particular type, right? Then we have culture C that are moral absolutists type 2, right? So, for instance, culture B holds something like this, right? The morality of absolute type 1 that we hold is the only correct morality, and every other type is incorrect. That's their stance. And culture C holds the same thing about their moral stance. Only type 2 is correct, every other stance is incorrect. Now, culture A, in holding to normative cultural relativism, has to defend the truth of each culture's dominant moral framework. So culture A says that culture B is correct, and that culture C is correct, right? But culture B and culture C are in contradiction with one another. It can't be the case that B is the only correct type of morality and everyone else is wrong, and that C is the only correct type and everyone else is wrong. Those are mutually incompatible claims, right? Not to mention that both of these positions conflict with the position of culture A, right? If B says only we're correct, that's obviously not only in conflict with culture C, but also with the relativism of culture A. So it quickly descends into logical incoherence. Not everybody can be correct. It can't be simultaneously true that murder is good and bad, right? It would seem to have to be one or the other, unless we're willing to slip back into moral nihilism and say it's all nonsense anyway, none of that means anything. So cultural relativism continued. The second problem, and one of the biggest worries, I think, is that it could be used as a justification for awful practices. If every culture is correct in its moral assertions, then nothing is morally out of bounds for any culture. Right? I have here a picture of the African slave trade, right? A very nasty event in world history, right? In our nation's history. It would seem that if every culture is correct, then we couldn't judge a culture for engaging in slavery, right? The cultural normative relativists would have to look back at the antebellum South in the United States and say, well, that was their culture, right? You can't pick and choose which cultures you attack and which you defend. If the view is every culture is correct in what they happen to believe, then that's what it means. And something like slavery, or the disenfranchisement of women, or female genital mutilation, which is a common practice in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, right? It's a horrific practice whereby young girls have their genitals mutilated so that they won't ever have pleasure when they're older and when they have sex, right? It's very horrific and it's universally condemned by most nations in the World Health Organization, but of course it's part of their religious tradition. So according to cultural relativism, it would be something we would have to say, well, it's their tradition, so we respect it. Child brides, right? In Pakistan, young girls are married off very, very young, sometimes as young as 10, 11, right? Maybe even younger. And this is, again, something that I think is pretty horrific and that we ought to be able to condemn and say this is something you shouldn't do. I mean, even something as extreme as human sacrifice, right? All of these things could have religious overtones, right, and often do, right? Many people, past and present, justify their use of slavery, their disenfranchisement of women, these sorts of practices through religious traditions, moral traditions, right? Can we not condemn any of these things as being bad? Well, if you're a cultural relativist, no, you can't. The third problem is what Mary Midgley discusses, the problem of what she calls moral isolationism. And this is a sort of strongly related issue to the question of cultural relativism. Midgley attacks this notion by considering a closely related idea of moral isolationism, which basically holds that we cannot understand any moral culture except our own, right? It's just impossible to even understand their culture, right? But she lays out a lot of problems with this view, right? The first one is, well, does this work both ways, right? Is it simply that we are unable to we in the West, in the U.S. or in England, which is where Mary Midgley lives or lived, she might have passed away. Anyway, does this work both ways? Are other cultures unable to comment on our culture? Because it doesn't seem as though most cultural relatives think that way, right? They're quite happy to accept the censure and blame of other parts of the world. They just don't want to give it themselves, right? Which seems to indicate a type of hidden superiority complex, as if we were so mighty and powerful that our words would shatter other cultures. We'll accept their praise because we can handle it, but they can't. They're too weak and they need to be coddled, right? That seems like a deeply insulting notion. Um, it would also block praise of other cultures as well as blame, right? Are we allowed to praise other cultures for their moral practices? If so, and it would seem strange if we couldn't, if you can't understand something at all, then you certainly aren't in a position to praise it any more than you are to blame it, right? Things you know nothing about are things you can't form any judgments on, whether they're of praise or blame. And also just the basic recognition that it isn't true. It isn't true that we can't understand other cultures, right? It's a denial of a basic rational ability. We're all human beings, and maybe we can't understand other cultures perfectly. That seems plausible, right? That seems true, right? And that we should always try to avoid making hasty or uninformed judgments. That's also true, right? But the moral isolationist takes it further than this and says, no, it's just not possible to form any conception of another moral tradition, right? That's anywhere close to accurate. And that doesn't seem plausible, right? Human beings have a lot more in common than we have different between us, right? Across races, across gender, across political and social boundaries, right? We can understand one another. It takes work and it takes a willingness to be empathetic, to use our reason, but we can do it. It's not impossible. Finally, one of the last critiques she makes is to ask a question: do we live ourselves in a unified moral culture, right? And the answer is obviously no, right? In the U.S. right now, we don't live in a sort of unified singular culture. We're a melting pot of a variety of different moral moral cultures, various traditions, religious beliefs, ethnic and national, and so on and so forth, backgrounds, right? I mean, these are all part and parcel of the American makeup, right? Or for Midgley, the British makeup, right? But if that's true, that would mean we couldn't even judge our own culture. We couldn't even assess our own moral beliefs, since there isn't a unified belief that we all adhere to. And that would make any moral progress impossible. And again, that would be to sort of hamstring our rational faculties, which is ridiculous. All right, so final thoughts here. The problems with normative relativism can be summarized as follows. The relativist wants to defend the existence of moral truths, but to reconsider them or reconceive of them as localized truths, right? X is true in this nation, false in that one, right? But this notion is simply incoherent, right? Truth is either universal or it isn't truth. There's no such thing as personal truth. There is personal opinion, right? But that's different than truth. Truth is something that is true across the board. That's what the word means, right? So the normative relativist is thus actually, it turns out, either a closet moral realist or a closet moral nihilist, right? These are the only two real positions. I think moral nihilism is a logically coherent position, and moral realism certainly is as well, right? Moral relativism is not a logically coherent position, right? Now, if we focus on the localized aspect of the claim, right, that these things are localized to various individuals or groups, then the relativist looks like a moral nihilist. Moral claims are simply expressions of group dynamics. They are social constructs with no real meaning. If we focus on the moral truth side, however, then the relativist looks like a moral realist. There are certain values that you ought to adopt, says the moral relativist, such as tolerance, respect, inclusion, etc. I certainly agree that those are good things, but if they are universally good, i.e. if they are the sorts of things that everyone should adopt, then the relativist is in fact defending the existence of absolute moral truths and is in fact a moral realist, right? If they say everyone should be tolerant, right, they're defending a view that everyone should hold, a universal truth, and they're a moral realist, right? So if tolerance, inclusion, and respect are only relatively good, i.e. relative to this or that culture, this or that group, then what could the relativists say to someone who rejected those principles in order to convince them that they should adopt those principles? The relativist says everyone's entitled to their own beliefs, everyone is correct in their own beliefs, and everyone should be inclusive and accepting. And then they find a person whose religion or personal beliefs or whatever says, no, acceptance and inclusion are bad, right? I don't have to be that way. What can the relativists say to them? If they say you should be that way, right, then they're violating the core tenets of relativism and telling them there's a way they ought to be, right? On the other hand, if they say, okay, fine, you don't have to be that way because it's not for you, then they're abandoning any sort of claim to anything being good and they fall back into the moral nihilist side. So I think relativists are actually moral nihilists in disguise, or probably more often, moral realists in disguise. Again, there's something that seems initially plausible about relativism, but when we really start thinking about it, it falls apart, and we get everything we wanted: tolerance, acceptance, inclusion, plus the ability to actually defend certain types of behavior and condemn other types of behavior by adopting a morally realistic position. Okay, that's it for this lecture. I will see you next time.